an introduction to using serious games for applied purposes, by which we mean changing something. And that might be education. That's a very kind of simple example, but it might be strategy. It might be innovation. It might be doing something that we could do in other ways, but wanting to do it in more fun, playful, engaging, gamified kinds of ways. So as a little warm-up exercise, I'd like us in our groups to just discuss the experience we might have had so far in our lives with using games. And, you know, we can think of games in a really broad sense. Anything that's playful in any way might count as a game. We're using games for purposes that are not just entertainment. So that might be something you've encountered in an educational context, or it might be some other sort of applied use of games. So just as a little warm-up, sometimes I use warm-up exercises, or even any exercises, not really to accomplish the goal that they explicitly want to achieve, but for some other kind of secondary effect. So presumably you now all feel warmed up and you've used your vocal cords. And what I'm interested in is, what were you talking about? If we just very quickly share one or two glimpses. Let's start this group here.
Yeah, so we teach pharmacology for B&B, and we do Owen and I to part of the same group. And we do, at the end of the course, we do an escape room. It's very, very creative. So we take all modules. So each question is related to a module. They have to answer it. It's related to a code, and we have proper boxes in the room. They have to open the box and say the patient with the drug, the final drug. So it's very, very nice.
Fantastic. Now, how many people know what an escape room is? Most people.
Yeah.
Pretty much everybody. Okay, fantastic. And how long? Tell us what tips or insights have you gained from going through that process? What do you know now that you didn't know the first time that you did it?
Well, first, it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
I don't do it. So it's a colleague of us that she developed it, and she spent the whole weekend doing this. So there are a lot of codes and etc. But the students get very well involved, and they really enjoy it at the end. And they can see all modules in one day, like basically all modules in one day. So yeah, that's the thing.
So that particular technique is that quite good at the kind of summation once they've already encountered it in a different way. It's not the first time they've encountered these things, but it really brings it together and that makes it feel kind of more adventurous and real and applied. Fantastic. Let's have two more. How about this group here?
I hope we had a chance to go around and say what games we use. I suppose Daniel and I are very pleased to sit next to each other because we've not met, but our teams collaborated on making a playful survey. So taking a traditional survey to ask students about their views and then turning it into a game adventure where they made choices that added to the game elements of it. So that was a really fun, exciting project.
Okay, so is there like a sort of narrative to it?
Yes.
Yeah, what was the narrative? What was the story?
Imperial enlisted the help, and you got to choose a woodland avatar. The DML created beautiful artwork for us. And then you kind of went on this journey, and at each stop you got to make choices, like what kind of teaching style you really like. And then it added, you chose a fruit from a tree that represented different things added to the basket. And there was a barista in the forest that offered you a menu of options, and and we can have Queen's Tower at the end with fireworks. It was all very exciting.
So feedback from students is often quite low, but I imagine maybe it was a little bit higher response rate.
I pitched it as kind of challenging all tricks in the survey market. It didn't result in quite the number of clicks that we would like. I guess we were targeting PhD students that perhaps didn't still a bit reluctant to click on a random link in an email. But it did deliver very good quality data, I'd say that.
Great.
And the learning from actually doing the project was just amazing.
Okay, fantastic. So not necessarily a way of recruiting more people to engage in the first place, but once they were engaged, you got really good data from it.
Yeah, I'd say that's
amazing, fantastic. I'm going to use that, I think, or some version of it. Okay, maybe one more. Somebody want to talk about from one of the other groups?
We were just acknowledging like more popular culture outside of Imperial, games that are used for learning, like Jo Lindsay and things like that.
Yeah. My owl is rotting. It looks really, they made it look as sad and gross as possible. But then what I do is I just click on the owl and I don't do any lessons, and then I go back and the owl looks bright. And this is an important principle, right? Because sometimes when we gamify things, there is a divergence between the kind of in-game achievements and whatever it is that we're trying to achieve in the real world. So for some weird reason, I've decided to game the way that my Duolingo owl looks on my phone, and I'm not learning any language skills. So bad gamification, we're going to come to that in a second. Why leave out this group? Come on, what have you guys, let's hear one little thing from you.
We talked about one game I developed also pharmacology, but then for postgraduate students called Movie Suitables. It's a bit of an end of module game that can be used as a bit of formative assessment, but it's more for fun. It's not serious.
Okay.
So in groups, students need to recognize a tune, movie tune, and then get a pharmacology question about the module afterwards. So they score points, and it's teamwork, and they have buzzers, and they are really fanatic.
Okay, fantastic. But there's an educational aspect to it.
There it is.
Yeah. So I mean, the term serious games is out there and it's used, but it's probably not the best label. Sometimes we prefer to say applied games, because if a game is too serious, then often it's not engaging, it's not fun, it's not doing the serious things that it's supposed to do. Sometimes we use the term unserious games. Okay, fantastic. So it seems like there's a lot of experience in this room using games in general, which is great. That means maybe we can focus particularly on role-playing games, which is something that we've been working on, and that will give us a little bit more focus. And these are some resources, again, that you can check out afterwards, that most of which we're involved with in some way or another. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit more about gamification, because this is actually quite common in the sustainability space. I don't know if you have something like this at Imperial, maybe this exact thing. Does anybody know if this exists at Imperial? So it exists at a lot of universities. It's students organizing for sustainability. It's the Green Impact Toolkit. And basically the way that it works is there are 100 sustainability actions, and they are things like organize a litter pick or raise awareness of digital sustainability. Each one of these will be on this kind of special website that you log into. It will be assigned a point value. Each school, faculty, we're divided into different groups within the university. We'll have a kind of team of volunteers to try and achieve these actions throughout the term. And you'll provide some very, very light evidence, some documentation that you have done so, and you'll be given points. And you'll get gold, silver, or bronze certification, and there'll be a leaderboard, which school has achieved the most sustainability actions over the course of this semester. So if we could take a minute or two, you might not be familiar with this particular system, but probably you're familiar with similar stuff. Just discuss these 3 prompts. What do you think the pros and cons of this approach are? What challenges or risks do you foresee? And then just to get ourselves in that kind of game designer mindset, how might you improve this particular system, this example of gamification? So I'll just give you a minute or two to discuss that in groups. Okay, fantastic. Let's just feedback a little bit. And there was an aspect of this that I didn't include, kind of deliberately, but I'll tell you now, is that these teams included staff and faculty members and also student volunteers. And I wonder if that might have changed the dynamics and might change the way you were thinking about it. But yeah, let's feedback. What were we chatting about here? Yeah. Sorry, I'm trying to focus on these guys. Yeah.
I guess we said a few different things, and I think one of them was kind of from the engineering perspective. Like, for example, maybe people can game of unify the game to be like, oh, we've raised awareness, guys, we're doing that, but like not actually doing it with deeply or like some money, but just doing it for the points.
Yeah, we're nice, we're sensible, we're passionate about sustainability. Would that really happen, do we think? Yes. Why? I mean, yes, I think so too. Why?
Competition rather than collaboration.
So for me, my experience having done this once, it was really that student-staff dynamic that because of course I want to collaborate with the students, But it was really at a certain point where it was like, well, I don't want to let them down. They've worked so hard. They've done all these things. I don't want to. I want us to win. Okay, fantastic. What about this group here? What were we talking about?
Yeah, we became a little bit cynical to begin with. Talked about is there a possibility that students are engaging with it and not actually, maintaining those habits? So is it actually developing sustainable habits?
The answer, I guess, from the Green Impact people is like maybe those individual students are, maybe they aren't, but the fact that you run it kind of every single semester with a new fresh start means that the system as a whole keeps going. One of the things that I do like about it is that there's the opportunity to feedback, to create your own actions, which then might become part of the repertoire of actions the next time round. But do we see any risks with that? So, and what do we think about 100 actions? What if it had said 1,000 actions? What if it had said 10 actions?
I think 100's a good balance, right? If you say 1,000, you're like, I'm never going to achieve all that. But maybe 10 doesn't push you,
So one of the things that I found here was a lot of counting things that already, additionality was a real problem, right? So things that you were already doing or would have happened already, you go through ticking, and 100 felt weirdly like maybe it was too many for that aspect of it. But then yes, your actions would feel constrained. So it's tricky. So what else were you guys talking about?
I mean, I think we sort of echoed where they were saying about gaming the game, like we were talking a little bit about cheating. So competition is good because it can be a motivator. But if you can see another team is like doing loads better than you and you can't be team.
Yeah. The biological sciences actually. How the hell did they get up to 350 points? What's going on there? So you were also, I think you were also describing that actually when another team is way ahead, that can be demotivating because you think, oh, we're never going to catch them. That's a game design problem. That's something you can catch. You can introduce a balancing feedback loop into your gamification design so that as one team goes ahead, it gets harder and harder for them to score points. I think that would be interesting if all teams were neck and neck for the whole semester. Then maybe that would unlock a different type of engagement. Which maybe brings me to the next question. Does anybody have anything positive to say about it? I share some kind of cynicism and reservations, but what is good? Why is it so widespread? Go on.
So if people find something intrinsically unpleasant but are rewarded, it does motivate them to do it. I think the same challenges. People did. Not when normally you have to have an extra walking particle from you to let you know I've got to walk more, but actually yes, I'm getting points.
So I guess that's then a game design test to put on. If you have gamified it, you actually want to check that these points are making it more pleasant. So another point that was made is that the verification process, the more arduous that gets, the less the points might actually feel like desirable. But people will do anything for points. I've done this in class. Just say, you have 5 points, and suddenly everybody wakes up. It's a bit scary. Okay. Does anybody have any final thoughts about this form of gamification?
I think quite resource intensive. You pointed out it's quite resource intensive to run.
Yeah.
It needs monitoring. It's not something that's just algorithm.
It is resource intensive, and I think it's quite good at extracting voluntary labor. So that's why it maybe feels like a reasonable way to go about things, because we're all giving our time for free. Well, not for free, but we're being paid in points. The points are printed for free. But it is interesting to think, like, what if all the resource that had been spent to set up this infrastructure was just paid to people for this to be a kind of part-time job on campus? I think what's perhaps one positive way of thinking about gamification is that actually it is everywhere. Sometimes it's not as pronounced as this, but whenever you projectize any kind of activity, you are making up certain rules and aims and things that feel like a point. We meet every Friday. We've met every Friday. We've unlocked an achievement. We have certain documents. So a gamification system might be similar to a to-do list or a Kanban board. So maybe a good way of thinking about gamification is not that it's a silver bullet, but that it's a kind of conscious and reflective way of thinking about how we manage projects so that they are fun and engaging and that the communication signals flow in interesting ways. But what if we did something even more interesting? So war games, tabletop exercises, this is probably familiar to you, and this is a very different approach to using play in applied or serious ways. So, Pentagon exercises, RAND Corporation exercises, you might have a red team, and then you might have a kind of adjudicator. There's some system of rules. They're simulations, effectively. So from these kinds of tabletop exercises, which obviously those were some pictures from the 1960s, but they continue to the current day, both in military context, but also kind of in corporate context. This is, I think, PwC offering tabletop exercises to whoever will pay for them. We have the emergence of peace games, not just war games, but the world game, sometimes called the World Peace Game by Buckminster Fuller. And this, again, is this very simulationist perspective, right? So this game also has been through many, many different iterations. I believe continues to be played in some version or not, worldgameworkshop.org, although the website now appears to be down, but they really focus on the data, right? They're saying, this is a simulation of the entire world. We're going to use kind of playful methods to engage with the simulation and to figure out hunger and other kind of sustainability goals, sustainability issues, and we're going to do that using as much kind of real data as possible. Any quick thoughts about this sort of approach using play for serious purposes? So it's basically a simulation, and the idea is the more accurate, the better. The better the data, the more granular, the better it is. Yeah.
So I've done quite a few of these. I used to do an activity called Mega Game, which is where you get together, say 100 people, and they're put into different teams and on different roles, and they're set a task. So, one of them was set in the 1980s Cold War. USSR invades West Germany, and it was doing a very militaristic war game. Or another one was looking at Europe during the Reformation. So you had someone who was a Bavarian Catholic priest, someone else who was a British Protestant baron, and everyone was trying to bounce off each other and trying to have their own motivations and things. And it was interesting for a few reasons. One of them that it did that was really good was it helped you to understand the context, because you were putting yourself in a position and you were seeing how other people were behaving in their position. You could see how those interactions, and it helped you to understand the different positionality of the people who were relevant to that role. The other thing it was really good at was helping to understand how teams work, how hierarchies work, and how people coordinate and things like that. So it was really interesting from that perspective as well. So I think those are two things that were really great about that point.
So in a really sort of practical way, like how long would a game take?
About a day.
Yeah.
About 100 people. There'd probably be about 10 people who were the control team, who were actually running the game, adjudicating rules and stuff.
Okay. Question for the room. Any questions for this person? Because that sounds like a really interesting and relevant experience.
Something I remember very clearly from school was some kind of French Revolution simulation game, and being assigned to be a peasant and feeling incredibly frustrated at the fact that there was no opportunity for empowerment through that. You just came away feeling more miserable at the end of the day because nothing you did made any difference. And I wonder if in these simulation games, how do you attribute agency? If you're assigned to a particular role, which you can never kind of escape, or does good game design always allow you to have an uprising? Or
so the game design was in such a way that everyone had a mechanic that they could be interacting with.
Is the world designed in such a way that everybody has it?
Yeah. Yes.
The real world.
Oh, well, it's a good question. Probably not. There are some people who have a lot more power and agency than others, and that's reflected in the games. If you were the emperor, you had a lot more power than if you were, a colonel on the battlefield who was told to do your thing and
And yet our assumptions about who has power and agency also deserve to be questioned. And sometimes themselves, the assumption that somebody doesn't have agency can be a way of taking agency away from them. And these are all things that we can explore through play. I think this is such a fascinating question, isn't it? Was there any capacity within these games to change the rules during play?
So the fundamental rules, not so much, but there were games where I did one based on the Iran-Iraq War, and there was a time where, as it's built into part of the game, the generals could rise up and overthrow the Minister of Defence if they weren't doing a good job, and they could appeal to Saddam and say, actually, I want to take over this role, and there was a lot of internal politics about that. So you could have individual people moving around roles, and they could be petitioning within their teams about different ways of doing things. So you could change it internally, but you couldn't change the
and yet in reality, the rules of reality change. We're in one paradigm and then suddenly the paradigm shifts. So this is, I'm kind of poking away at one of my issues, I guess, with a simulationist paradigm, which I think these games have an enormous amount of value, and we've touched on some of the pros. But how do you keep alive that, or maybe it happens automatically, keep alive that sense that this is a model of reality, and no matter how much data we pour in, we're going to have certain assumptions here. The rules, the map is not the territory, the model is not the world. How do you deal with that? How do you address that? Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry if I'm talking about, but I think one of the values of games for us here at Imperial, where students' lives are often incredibly predictable in terms of career trajectories and so on, is that often introducing an element of randomness is brilliant, because suddenly it's not all about making the right strategic decision at the right time.
Right.
You've got to deal with complexity and uncertainty, and it's kind of, you're in a situation in which you can't actually have complete agency. And my goodness, that's good for all of us. That even a huge, complex, uncertain world out there, but university, incredibly predictable, right? Know where you're going to be Monday, 9 o'clock, know what the learning outcomes are. I know what's going to be, I'm expected to achieve an exam. So where is the dice?
Yeah. Yes, fantastic.
Where are the dice?
And I almost want to move away to the next bit because we're running short on time, but really fascinating. Obviously, a lot more to talk about, and randomness is a good place to leave it. I guess maybe the only other thing to touch on is that sometimes a more accurate simulation is less fun to play. There are these trade-offs. But yeah, coming together for a day to tell a story together is probably pretty engaging as a baseline. So you don't really need to worry about it. Tabletop role-playing games. The best known example is Dungeons and Dragons. Who here is familiar with tabletop role-playing games? Like a couple, not too many, right? So very, very small nutshell. In a tabletop role-playing game, you will usually have a moderator or a facilitator, often called the storyteller or the dungeon master or the game master, and this person will describe a world, describe a set of circumstances. The individual players will each be portraying somebody in this world, and they will describe their actions, and you will collaboratively tell a story. And when there is uncertainty or jeopardy or conflict, there's usually some rule for resolving that, and it usually involves dice, randomness. That's one kind of role-playing, tabletop role-playing game. There are also those that don't have that hierarchy. There isn't a game master, there isn't a facilitator. Everybody kind of contributes at the same level. And what Polina and I and many other people in the applied African speculative fiction kind of team or network or kind of group of people that Polina knows have been experimenting with is this type of game. What I like about this is that it really comes from a kind of art and creative origin, right? So it's sometimes a little bit unpredictable the way that it works, but it really places desire and fun and engagement at the forefront, and it is open in a way that I think a lot of simulationist games, especially the kind of simpler ones, a lot of traditional gamification isn't open. What I mean by open is when you're thinking about the future, when you're thinking about what a sustainable future might look like, or if we even want to use that word sustainability and all the assumptions and values that are embedded in it. If you play a simulation, if you play a simulation like, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals game, 2030 game, very, very popular, very big in Japan, and you can come out with good outcomes or bad outcomes, but there is a fixed set of outcomes. Whereas when you're collaboratively storytelling, in theory, in principle, anything could happen. And I think that's particularly for engaging young people, but also for engaging me, I find that quite exciting. And I think it has something in common really with all good teaching. I think in all good teaching, there is that element of trying to pose questions, open-ended questions that will take you to new and unexpected places. So we've been doing this as part of the Applied African Speculative Fiction, and previous and parallel to that, a project called Imagine Alternatives, climate crisis, climate injustice, and also as a way of processing and thinking about eco-anxiety. And I guess the origin was Kampala Yénkya, was the first kind of game that we did in this way. Is that right? It is, isn't it? What's that? It's a noise. Never mind the noise.
It's drilling downstairs. Yeah.
Okay.
It's not.
It is. Are they going to drill through?
No.
Okay. Well, if they do, let's be ready to pounce. So Kampala Yénkya was originally actually loosely based on an existing game, Avery Alder's The Quiet Year. And after a lot of kind of co-production, primarily these short stories written by Dilman Dilla to create a future Uganda, we kind of built out this system of prompts and questions that would allow a group of young people to explore what a sustainable future for Kampala might look like. And there they are doing some of it. So there's a map making element to this. Map, in a very loose sense, what the map really functions as in the game is a mnemonic tool. So when somebody asks you, as somebody who's maybe not experienced at storytelling, just to say what happens next in the story, or say what happens next in the world, that is terrifying. You need support, you need inspiration. And the map is one kind of inspiration. So people are doodling, and when a question comes to you in the midst of this game, for example, there's a flood, what happens? You go blank, you look down at the map and you see that somebody has drawn a structure. And you think, okay, flood affects that structure. And suddenly you're inspired, suddenly things begin to pop off. And it's also obviously a really lovely memento to have at the end. So from this game, we've started to develop a number of kind of localizations and customizations and what in the tabletop role-playing game world would be called hacks. So when you take a game and you modify it, that could be called a hack or a reskinning. And we've got a few of them now. That's me trying to play a version of it with, like, I think 8-year-olds, which was beautiful chaos. All of these resources are available online and they are all free. There is the Values in Research game, which we'll spend the last couple minutes looking at. But before we do that, I just want to kind of summarize a few tips when it comes to creating games. You all have lots and lots of experience, so you may disagree with some of this, but this is my version of it. That when making games, it's good to have both divergent and convergent thinking. In other words, periods where you're doing wild brainstorming, coming up with ideas, and then periods where you are filtering, editing, and making sure that the game is properly balanced. My top tip is to steal. So begin with a game that already exists and that is proven to work and be fun. Do some research to expand your horizons. People often seem to want to begin with Snakes and Ladders or Monopoly or something that's maybe not that fun. So explore a little bit. Games are non-linear systems. They are unpredictable. You cannot know what a game is going to be like until you actually play it. So the way that you develop a game is to begin by stealing, and then you just iterate. You play test it, you gather feedback, you tweak, and you keep doing that until it is something that is fun and achieves what you want it to achieve. Expect little tweaks to create issues, iterate rapidly, And as we've already covered, games, like all models, make simplifications and embed assumptions and values. A couple little risks, maybe. I think everything I said before is fairly conventional in game design terms. Maybe this is a bit less conventional. I think when you get feedback from your players, you should imagine that the feedback is definitely telling you something, but it might not be what it's saying on the surface. So, for example, whenever I play test a game or just play a game with a group, we do the digital sustainability game, people will make suggestions that it would be cool if you could do this, because you can do this in the real world. And players won't think, well, actually, how will that affect the balance of the game? Will that enter into this non-linear system and break all kinds of things that were perfectly balanced, that were what made it fun and engaging? So that's where people's minds go, make a game more similar to reality. Other things to know: when you make a game, it works wonderfully for you, and then you pass it to another facilitator, it may work completely differently. Some of what is obvious to you about how a game should work may not be obvious to others. So writing the rules of a game is its own kind of art that's almost slightly separate in some ways to game design. And then I know we're celebrating kind of the power of these tabletop role-playing games to expand the imagination, to imagine futures that you otherwise wouldn't. But I would put a caveat on that often people, when they're given a blank canvas, they reach for things that are familiar. So often you will meet a group of students and you will ask them to design a kind of sustainable future, and the sustainable future that they design will be the one that they've learned from Elon Musk, or it will be the one that they've learned from Blade Runner. There's actually a lot of resistance to creating a positive future because there are so many dystopias out there. So that's a game design problem. That's a storytelling problem. How do you give them the inspiration, the ingredients to create something genuinely new